My name's Mallery-Blythe. I'm the founder of PHIRE, which stands for Physicians' Health Initiative for Radiation and Environment. I put together this group in concept probably about 10 years ago now. And then slowly people have congregated, scientists and medical doctors have come together to form this initiative, which is all about non-ionising radiation health effects. And the reason that I started this is because exposures to non-ionising radiation have risen really dramatically in recent years. And certainly as a medical doctor, I was never trained about this, literally nothing at all. In terms of my medical education, we got a few days on ionising radiation and nothing on non-ionising. So it was this obvious knowledge gap that I thought, well, no matter the outcome, we need to at least educate ourselves to know where we're headed with this, given the huge rises in exposure. And I want to give huge thanks to Brian Steen, the chairman of the Radiation Research Trust, who umbrellas, he has a registered charity here, which umbrellas PHIRE, and they have supported financially this meeting today, so massive thank you for such important work. I also want to thank the Children with Cancer UK charity, who've also given huge support to, in general, preventative aspects of cancer research, which is incredibly important, and many charities are not focused on prevention. So I want to say a massive thank you to them who have also heavily supported us. So in terms of today's meeting, I've called this a strategy meeting. And the reason I've done that is because we've been regularly sharing science and having conferences like this for many years. But what often happens is experts all come together and they tell their science, they explain their truth, but then there's often not a lot of opportunity to discuss what we do with that evidence. And the scientific community is somewhat isolated from the public and from groups that also have an interest in this. So the point of this meeting really was to bring together people that all have a potential interest and have an input in terms of how we can move forward in a sensible and truly progressive way. I've already mentioned that I'm the founder of PHIRE and trustee for the Radiation Research Trust, but also I'm a medical advisor for an Australian group called the Oceania Radiofrequency Scientific Advisory Association. I'll mention them a bit later. And also a member of a new UK group, and we've got several representatives from this group, including our chairman, Andrew Tester there. IGNIR is a new guideline setting group, and this is really opportune timing, given that there's been a huge call for new biologically based guidelines. So I'll say a bit more about that group towards the end. And I'm a medical advisor also for ES UK, who are represented here today as well. In terms of our agenda, you all have a copy of that in your information packs, and Brian Steen will be speaking after me. We're sorry that David G., who very much wanted to be here today, unfortunately couldn't make it, but Brian, our chairman, will do a fantastic job, I think, of outlining, again, the foundation of why we're here, some legacy of previous environmental health disasters that it would be sensible to try and prevent. Following him, Dr. Dimitris J. Panagopoulos, perfect timing, who will be talking to you about anthropogenic or man-made fields, their effects on DNA and mechanisms for that. The mechanism debate is very important because radiofrequency radiation was designated as a Group 2B carcinogen back in 2011, and one of the things that held it back from a higher category was lack of clear mechanistic data. But a huge amount has evolved since that point, and he'll be presenting some of that very important research following. Dimitris J. Panagopoulos defined one of the earliest mechanisms that I think is relevant to this. He was one of the first people who explained the action on the voltage-gated calcium channel. And he's going to give you a lot more information on that, but I found that very important. As a medical doctor, when I researched that subject, that resonated with me as being a sensible mechanism that keys in with disease endpoints in a medically really rational way. So a huge thank you to him for his very important work in that area. Professor Martin Paul will be extrapolating that, speaking more on that, and also explaining some of the systemic effects, particularly looking at Wi-Fi, 5G, and their behaviour with this early point in physiological interaction at the VGCC. Dr. Fiorella Belpoggi, thank you so much. This is the director of the Ramazzini Institute study that was released this year that is so, so important. And she'll be explaining detail on that and why this year this evidence has suddenly moved forward. She'll be linking that in with evidence from the National Toxicology Programme in the States, which has also played a big role in why we're here today. That report was released only a few days ago in its final published form. And the results from these two studies key in with research that precedes it for decades, but really gives us a level of evidence now which is utterly indisputable. So thank you to her for explaining that in more detail to you. Professor Anthony Miller will be speaking to you about RF for the evidence on cancer and the justification for a new IARC review. He has a legacy of important work with the World Health Organization and IARC. All of the biographies for these people will be explained by Brian Steen in a moment, but just to explain the caliber of scientists we have here today, his work in this area is outstanding, and he'll be explaining to you specifically the current situation on evidence for cancer. Then we'll have some panel questions. I've asked our presenters if they can to try and stick to about 20 minutes, allowing 10 minutes for questions at the end of each presentation. I have no doubt that just like me, some of them will have a tendency to run on a little. But so we've got another panel question time at the end for all of those scientists and doctors. Then we'll have some lunch, and following that we have Professor Dennis Henshaw, who's going to join us a little later. He'll be explaining a bit more about low-frequency fields, which are equally important. I've often focused on RF because that's where we've seen these huge rises, but actually the extremely low frequencies are equally important. And some would say more so in terms of certain health effects. And so he'll be talking about that. He'll also be presenting mechanisms that explain some of the science that he has witnessed. Then we'll have Dr. Sarah Starkey. Thank you so much for joining us today. Sarah's going to be presenting a really important paper that she published a couple of years ago. And this is a critique of a report that here in the UK is very important because it's dictated public health policy on this issue. It was written in 2012, but we still use that to explain the effects of this to the public. And there are some very serious problems with that report, which she has critiqued in detail and will be explaining to you. And then I'm going to try and bring all of that brilliant work together in a way that we can try and draw some conclusions and move forward into our strategy meeting and discussion that will follow. So just in the few minutes that I have left, I'm going to very quickly cover some very basic points as an introduction and a foundation to some of these speakers' work. I'm going to explain to you some of the some quick facts about non-ionising radiation, some vulnerabilities of children, a few key endpoints that I think have relevance to the paediatric community, some of their thoughts on obstruction to progress, and accountability, which I think may play a fairly pivotal and key role in trying to progress and move forward. So I've already mentioned we're talking here today about non-ionising radiation, and we're going to be discussing both aspects of RF, which is the common radio frequency communication devices, and also some of the power frequencies at the lower frequency end of the spectrum. Some fast facts about RF. It can damage biology at non-thermal levels. So this means very low intensity effects. And this is well established in the scientific community. I don't personally know of a single independent scientist or medical doctor that challenges this at this point. The problem is that the groups that dictate public health policy generally are not independent. And there is still question about this in that community. But that is a minority community. There are no UK safety limits to protect against that kind of damage. So right now we use the ICNIRP guidelines. They were designed to protect over actual heating of cells, heating of tissues. But we know through thousands of papers that there are effects orders of magnitude below that, and we have no safety standards to encompass those. In addition to that, these particular guidelines were only designed for very short exposures, about 6 minutes. They were never designed to take into account cumulative effects. So clearly there's a huge inadequacy in that paradigm. Biological disruption is not linearly proportional to either frequency or intensity. And the reason this is so important is it means that we can't predict outcomes. The outcomes vary in space and time in a way that become very unpredictable. And this justifies even more a precautionary approach. But I'll speak more about precaution later, because I think we're well past a time where you can call any of this precautionary. It's become more of an emergency. And I made a bold statement there that the ICNIRP guidelines that we currently use are not protective of health, but please don't take my word for that. This is from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and this is just pointing out the generalization by many that these guidelines protect human beings from harm by any or all mechanisms is not justified. That was many years ago, and yet we still use those guidelines. I want to roll back the clock for a minute to the 70s, and the only reason I do this is because we had a wealth of literature that appeared around that time, and some preceding that, like this from the Office of Naval Research. And these were credible groups, and there were lots of papers like this that pointed out some key points, that biological effects depend on energy absorption, frequency, polarization, the character of the biological absorber, the tissue type, and frequency and amplitude windows. This is what makes this non-linear, is that you can have lower frequencies that have a more powerful biological effect. So this was all noted in the 70s, along with things like this in their conclusions. Low intensity effects, these non-thermal effects, calcium handling changes, this will come up in the presentations today, and you'll see how important that is. DNA damage, alteration in growth rates, variable sensitivity levels of some organisms. That's electromagnetic hypersensitivity, that's what we call it in humans. That CNS effects predominate. We see this over and over again in the literature, and that can be partially explained certainly by Martin Paul's theory. That the frequencies of maximal effect coincide with brainwave frequencies. These are all fascinating points, but why, with that important information about biological harm from really credible groups, did we allow this huge proliferation in intensities of exposure? And it's not just the intensity that is so different to natural background radiation in this frequency area. It's also the frequency of it, in that we had a natural radio quiet zone here. So here in green, you can see a big dip at around 1 gigahertz, and that's exactly the area of the spectrum that we filled in with anthropogenic or man-made radiation. So it's different in terms of intensity, dramatically. We're talking about, some studies would say 10 to the 18, a quintillion times higher in terms of intensity, but also in frequency, and also with other important characteristics like polarization, which Dimitrios Panagopoulos will speak more about. So they noted these window effects, polarization effects. Other things that I've picked up in the literature that's come is cumulative exposure is really important. What type of signal it is, whether it's intermittent or continuous, information carrying contact seems to make this more biologically active. And EMF and chemical synergy is very important. So in real life situations, it's not like it is in the lab where we often have a very specific exposure that is controlled. In real life, we have these exposures of different types of radiation overlapping in space and time. And in addition to that, we have chemical stresses in the environment that have also escalated. And there's clear evidence that chemicals can interact with this type of EMF. And 2 and 2 makes 5. They have this synergistic effect where there's enhanced biological damage. In real life, we have interference. We have multiple wave crossover that can lead to constructive interference, creating hotspots in the room or in somebody's body even. And of course, the people we're talking about in terms of health here, they're not like the routers that came off the production line. Our children vary in age, sex, comorbidity, or other concurrent illness, and their level of sensitivity. So again, this means we have this very unpredictable set of health effects. So to mention vulnerable groups, there are lots of different vulnerable groups, but today I'd like to focus on children. We know children are more vulnerable for a really long list of reasons, but to just touch on a few, they have less shielding of their brain. And I'm not keen on that term shielding, because the truth is, bone is a living tissue, it's very important. But it's there partly to protect the delicate brain tissue, and they have a much higher absorption. Particularly neonates have a higher body water composition, which makes them more efficient microwave absorbers. And their nervous systems and all their other systems are still developing. They have a lot more stem cells, which we know are exquisitely sensitive to this kind of radiation. Of course, they have a longer time ahead of them for the latent effects. And we now know that potentially the carcinogenic effects of this are very like ionizing radiation. They can take decades to manifest. So they'll still be in the prime of their life, potentially, when some of these effects play out. And there are some facts and figures about how much extra radiation they can absorb. 60% more than an adult in some cases, and up to 10 times greater in bone marrow. And this is a graphic that just shows the penetration of that radiation deeper into their skull when you compare a 5-year-old with an adult. So I'm not an expert in mechanisms. I'm going to leave that to my colleagues, but I just want to point out that we now have credible mechanisms, and these are some of the ones I've identified in the literature as probably playing a role. Induction of reactive oxygen species, or oxidative stress, that definitely plays a role. This is a very strong mechanism. The literature is incredibly strong here. So is it for altered calcium handling, gene expression changes, DNA damage potentially by both genetic and epigenetic mechanisms, and inhibition of DNA repair. These are all things that are cited in the literature quite regularly, and we're going to focus on some of these mechanisms today. But oxidative stress, I want to point out, is so important. We know it's happening. We know this now. And this fuels the degeneration and aging process of cells. Is therefore linked with so many different disease endpoints, and these are just a few of them. But obviously anything that fuels that system will increase risk of these kinds of endpoints. So it's no surprise that many of these endpoints have been linked with RF exposure and ELF exposure in the literature. I'm just going to highlight these: cancer, depression, electromagnetic hypersensitivity. The reason I've highlighted these is for a specific slide. This is data from the National Office of Statistics. I think if we're looking for biological justification in children and knowing how to protect them best, we need to look at what's killing children in our generation in the UK. And I was devastated when I downloaded this slide because I was previously using the 2013 data. This is from 2016, and what it shows us is that suicide has risen. In this slide, it's overtaken road traffic accidents as the highest cause of death in children. Now, this is mixed data with poisoning also, but we know that suicide has risen dramatically, and depression in young people. We have to take that very seriously. Then we have RTAs, and then below that we have a host of different types of cancer, including brain cancers, hematopoietic cancers. Now, Anthony Miller and PHIRE Belpoggi are going to touch on this in more detail, but just to show this graphic, which I think is very powerful. Again, this was from quite some years ago now. The reflex study funded by the EU, some controversy about it at the time, but actually totally validated through courts of law. And you can see graphically the DNA damage of 24 hours of mobile phone radiation and how comparable that is to the equivalent of about 1,600 chest x-rays. That's old data, but now hugely consolidated by new studies like the Ramazzini Institute study and the NTP study. So we're going to be presenting those today. And this one hot off the press in the last few days. Martin Paul, we mentioned depression. He's written a very credible paper on how there is a credible mechanism to explain exposure to the outcome of neuropsychiatric effects. So I'll let him talk about that in more detail. And my subject of expertise is electromagnetic hypersensitivity. So I must say a few words on this because this does link in with many of the symptoms we're seeing in children. It's often not called that. It's called a lot of other things. Sometimes it's just a list of symptoms, but this is what is being featured. I've described this as a multi-systemic physical medical condition characterized by increased sensitivity to electromagnetic fields of increasingly broader frequency ranges at lower and lower intensities. And to translate that a little bit into real-life terminology, people often get headaches from mobile phones. And if you allow them to continue those exposures, they will start to get headaches from other exposures like Wi-Fi, sometimes fluorescent lighting emissions, mobile phone base stations. And if you continue to allow a high exposure, then the intensities required for those symptoms to manifest will become less and less. They'll get it from further away. Somebody can make a call somewhere else in the room and they will get a headache. And this is real. It's been demonstrated in peer-reviewed, double-blinded, published provocation studies. It is not caused by the nocebo effect. That is not scientific. There's another potential condition that you may call electrophobia that is reasonable, but that's totally separate to electromagnetic hypersensitivity. Now, of course, there's wide-ranging symptoms. This is exactly what we would expect from a radiation-induced illness. And these encompass every system, but they're often called non-specific. I would argue with that a little bit, because although there are a lot of them, they do form identifiable constellations. And these are some of the classic ones: insomnia, headaches, dizziness, vertigo, tinnitus, cardiac palpitations. These are some of the classic hallmark symptoms that we see in constellation, and they arrive in a dose-response fashion to exposures. For example, this is a dose-response outcome from a mobile phone base station study. And you can take away those exposures and see a reduction in the whole constellation of symptoms. I've been collecting papers for many years, and these are just a few. This is a small snapshot showing exposures from all different sources, so mobile phones, Wi-Fi routers, mobile phone base stations, MRI scanners, radio transmitters, smart meters, etc. So we're seeing this same constellation of symptoms from many, many different sources having varying types of EMF. This is strong evidence for causality. This fits well with what we call the Bradford-Hill causality criteria. So I mentioned I would touch on obstacles. You know, why with this incredibly strong evidence base that dates back for decades? Why has this happened again? This makes the tobacco industry look like child's play. This is not the first time that we've taken something which can be considered a known environmental toxin and then allowed it to be freely used in public and to escalate to a level which we have no idea of the true depth of the potential outcome in terms of harm to health. Of course, there's socioeconomic pressure. There's no point in denying it. We're all well aware of that. But to translate that into some of the obstructions that I have seen through the course of the last 10 years, that causes obstruction to funding productive science, valid science. Conversely, it can also fuel the construction of inappropriate science. If you want to design a study to fail to show an effect, that's incredibly easy, especially if you know that subject very well. But you need somebody who knows that subject equally well, who is a real expert in that, to pick apart the methodology and find the weakness in that study that made it predictably fail. There's a problem with marginalisation in that this has been sidelined out of mainstream medicine, and that's wrong. This is hard and fast science that's been there for a long time. This should be absolute core of mainstream medicine, given the exposures are ubiquitous and they affect every system. There's a problem with legal inaccessibility. You know, sometimes in the past, the most efficient pathway to an honest outcome and protection for the public is litigation. The problem is the average person who's realising that this is a problem that's affecting their life. In this country, you have to either have very little money or a great deal of money to have access to litigation. And everyone else in between doesn't really have that access. It's very, very difficult. Medical ignorance is a massive problem. As I mentioned at the very beginning, doctors have not been taught about this issue. And that causes two problems. One, that they can be extremely ignorant and take in readily misinformation, which is not scientific. And secondly, even those who are open can feel embarrassed about trying to suddenly walk into a forum where they don't know anything. They find it hard to engage in a debate where they haven't been taught the science. And they don't have much time. I know how that feels. I ran trauma rooms for many years. You don't have time to read outside of your subjects. So this has to be built in to education programs. And of course, as a result of all of these things, there's a social ignorance. The average person on the street does not think that there's any problem here. And that means political inactivity. Because if a person on the street doesn't see a problem, they're not going to tell their MP. And even if the MP feels that there's a problem, they can't respond to an inactive body of constituents who don't see a problem. Accountability is an issue. You know, the wireless industry have been very clear that they've never said this is safe. They've done quite the opposite. They've given copious warnings. Insurance companies won't cover this. They're risk analysts that should tell people a great deal. Health protection agencies, should they be accountable? I think so. That's who I look to for solid advice and a real reflection of the science. It's interesting that our health protection agency changed their name to Public Health England, which kind of almost, if it says what it does on the can, that's more of an observation of health effects rather than actual health protection, which is certainly what we're seeing right now. But in fairness, the UK Chief Medical Officer issued this warning many years ago, saying that under 16s, children under 16, should not be using mobile phones except for essential calls. The problem is that that very important warning was then buried. They didn't tell anybody. It's still on an obscure website somewhere that no parents ever see, no governors ever see, no teachers, and maybe most importantly, the children themselves, some of which have massive capacity to understand this, They have no idea that warning exists. And when you have an important warning like that about a cell phone, why would you then give children in their educational forum iPads which can have a higher specific absorption rate than a smartphone? That's totally counterintuitive, and it's not scientifically based, but that is what is happening. And in fact, so many schools don't know about the cell phone warning that they actively encourage or demand that the children do their homework on mobile phones. So in terms of moving forward, so many other countries are overtaking us here. They've reduced their safety limits, in some cases by orders of magnitude below ours. There's many appeals, many international appeals. This is just one of the most recent, the 5G appeal, pointing out that further deployment, given how high exposures already are, further deployment of the same kinds of EMF is wholly irresponsible. So with all of these countries taking steps, I call this meeting to look at our practice here in the UK, to share some valid, important mainstream science and say what should we be doing to move forward. So in summary, RF and ELF, but we'll focus on RF for this sentence, it can cause serious biological damage at low intensity or non-thermal exposures. We have no present safety standards that protect against that kind of biological damage. Children are especially vulnerable. Accountability is evolving. UK medical doctors are uneducated on this issue. Public Health England have not taken any action to my knowledge to try and protect the health of children, but other countries are taking action. So thank you so much for listening. I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Brian Steen, and he's going to explain a little bit more about some of the background to all of this.